The Jaunt is a short story by Stephen King and can be found in Skeleton Crew, a short story collection which was published in 1985. My original copy is long gone, but I was happy to find a pretty good copy a couple of months back. This is the one. I read Skeleton Crew as a teenager way back when in the 80s. And two or three of the stories stuck in my mind, but none more so than The Jaunt, and I was excited to read it again recently. If you haven't read it, but you do have the book or can get a copy, then read it first and then come back. I'm going to stray well into spoiler territory. But if you have read it, or if you don't intend to read it, then let us proceed. Teleportation is a common enough science fiction trope, and Stephen King even pinched the term jaunt from Alfred Bester's The Stars My Destination, where people have personal teleportation devices. And then of course from the small screen there's the Beam Me Up Scotty transporter from Star Trek. And the notion of teleportation gone wrong is not ignored by earlier horror writers either. Who can forget David Cronenberg's classic movie The Fly? Stephen King being mainly a horror writer, something is bound to go wrong, right? It's a short story, so Stephen King doesn't muck about. Within the first page or two he's set the scene already. We're in the future, the 2400s, and teleportation is a thing, the jaunt of the title. Humanity has colonised the solar system, initially in search of oil and now in search of water. The Oates family is off to Mars, and they're getting ready to jaunt. Dad, as an employee of Texaco Water, is an old hand at jaunting, but it's the first time for the rest of the family, and they're nervous. The kids nag Mark, the dad, to tell them the story behind the jaunt. They settle in, and Mark begins to tell the tale. We get taken back to a crazy professor, Dr. Caroon, and he has a rudimentary teleport device already working in his lab. He can send inanimate objects from one side of the room to the other. A pencil, some keys, a calculator, other bits and pieces. Caroon is already imagining revolutionising the postal service, the freight industry, anything where objects move from A to B. But what about people? Can we send people? In time-honoured fashion, Caroon hurriedly buys some mice to test it out. King goes into some nice detail about Caroon's testing process. The first few mice go through okay, but on closer inspection they are not quite right. He had thrown in a squirming, very frisky and alive little animal, but here was something that seemed to be a living waxwork likeness of a mouse. Caroon snapped his fingers in front of the mouse's small pink eyes. It blinked and fell dead on its side. This is not encouraging, and it's a harbinger of the horrors to come. He puts one mouse just halfway through, tail first, with no issues, and there's a great image of the innards of the mouse as seen from the other side of the first portal, with all its blood flowing through the vessels and so on. Caroon begins to deduce that the teleportation process must have some effect on the brain, or at least on the mind. What the hell is in there, Caroon wonders. Sensory input, he thought. When they go through, they see something, hear something, touch something, or God, maybe even smell something that literally kills them. But what? Meanwhile, as Mark tells a sanitised version of the story to his family, one with less dead mice, his family is beginning to relax, and we get some glimpses of the background. They're clearly in the teleport equivalent of the boarding gate, but there are couches and attendants with what look like oxygen canisters and disposable masks working their way down the line of couches. Why do they need couches, and what's the gas for, we wonder? Back in the lab, it occurs to Caroon to knock out a mouse and send it through. Ta-da! This mouse is A-OK, positively frisky once it wakes up. At this point, King begins to inject some more tension, some jeopardy, a horror element into the story by introducing the next stage of Caroon's research, which is now under the auspices of the US government. A death row prisoner is offered the opportunity to get a pardon if he agrees to be the first conscious guinea pig in the human trials of the jaunt process. In the tiny, tiny fraction of a second it takes to send him 2 miles away, his hair has turned white and his face haggard, especially his eyes. His face had not changed in any physical way. It wasn't lined or jowly or wasted, but it gave the impression of great, almost incredible age. Foggia shuffled out of the portal, his eyes bulging blankly, his mouth twitching and his hands splayed out in front of him. Presently he began to drool. His last words before replicating the mouse experience and dropping dead are, "It's an eternity in there." That right there is the horror in this story, or at least the first dose of it. How would a human mind, a human consciousness, deal with facing eternity? Akin to infinity in the 3 physical dimensions, eternity is an infinite time, is beyond human comprehension. Alone with only your thoughts, forever, or at least for a subjective duration that might as well be forever. What would you see? What would you imagine? What would you believe or hallucinate? It's an effective torture technique to deprive an isolated person of a sense of time. Most can only withstand this for a day or two. What might it be like for eternity? Too much by King's reckoning. Enough not to just drive you insane, but on being snapped back to the real world, it's enough to kill you, stone dead. Back to the story then. Fortunately for humanity's development and for weaning itself off the diminishing stocks of oil, Carroon determines that unconscious sentient beings, higher animals like mice and yes humans, come through a jaunt entirely unaffected. We just need to be asleep. Now it becomes clear why the couches and why the gas cylinders. This is all necessary preparations for a jaunt. The origin story concluded, the Oates family is ready to rock and roll, and the attendant begins to put them under. Mark first, to show them how it's done. Tragically, they haven't accounted for a curious 12-year-old boy. A boy that was the first to take any dare. A boy who fell from the tallest tree on their property. A boy willing to go faster than anyone else on his slide board. A boy not well acquainted with fear. It's time for the second dose of horror. The punchline, the money shot, the payoff for this patient build-up. Suddenly we're on Mars, in the arrival area, the recovery room if you like, at the other end of the jaunt. Mark surfaces into consciousness, awareness, a little bit woolly in the head. There are screams. Is that his wife? She is distraught, pointing towards something. The thing that had been his son bounced and writhed on its jaunt couch. A 12-year-old boy with a snow-white fall of hair and eyes which were incredibly ancient. The corneas gone a sickly yellow. Here was a creature older than time, masquerading as a boy, and yet it bounced and writhed with the kind of horrid, obscene glee, and at its choked lunatic cackles the jaunt attendants drew back in terror. Claw hands beat and twisted and danced on the air. Abruptly they descended, and the thing that had been his son began to claw at his face. "Longer than you think, Dad," it cackled. "Longer than you think. Held my breath when they gave me the gas. Wanted to see. I saw. Longer than you think, Dad. Longer than you think." Cackling and screeching, the thing on the jaunt couch suddenly clawed its own eyes out. Blood gouted. The recovery room was an aviary of screaming voices. "Longer than you think, Dad. I saw. Long jaunt. Longer than you think." It said other things before the jaunt attendants were finally able to bear it away, rolling its couch swiftly as it screamed and clawed at the eyes that had seen the unseeable for ever and ever. It said other things, and then it began to scream. But Mark Oates didn't hear it, because by then he was screaming himself. Oh my goodness. When I was a kid, I nearly shit myself at this ending. It gave me nightmares. But of course I read it again and again. Now, as a dad myself for close to 25 years, I get a different kind of fright from it. To see your child change this way would be truly horrific. Especially if we add the fact that Mark's choice to sanitize the story, skipping the more gruesome effects of the experiments, meant that Ricky was less cautious than he might have been. The science in this story is shonky, pretty much non-existent, and in fact it was originally rejected by Omni for that reason. I don't care. I love this short story. It's a great example of how in just 30 pages, slightly under actually, it's possible to tell a full tale, to grab the reader and to bring them into a new world. Make us care sufficiently for the characters to be sucked in and then slapped about a bit by what transpires. This story has stayed rent-free in my head for almost 40 years, which is a long time. Longer than you think!